Visit sailrite.com for all your project supplies, tools, and instructions. In this video, we're going to show you how to refinish an RV side table, but instead of painting or applying new formica to our tabletop, we're going to cover it in a vinyl fabric from Sailrite.
This video is part of our Airstream Argosy renovation. We'll be renovating an Airstream from top to bottom, inside and out. Join us for this exciting video series.
In this first chapter, we'll cut out a piece of vinyl that we're going to use as our top plate on our tabletop.
This is the trim they have on the edges of the board where it comes up against the wall. We don't really need it, so we're going to remove it with a staple remover. It actually comes off fairly easy once you get it started. So watch if I can get an end started. There we go. Now I can just kind of pry up like this as I go along. And we'll remove this all around the perimeter. Okay, we're going to put the table on top of our fabric. This is a Sunbrella Horizon fabric. It's a vinyl fabric that is actually a 4-way stretch fabric. We're going to add a 1/2 inch around the perimeter. So this side's straight, so I'm going to just make sure that it's a 1/2 inch around the perimeter. One way you can do that is you could use this flexible curve that Sailrite sells. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut on the inside of the 1/2 inch line that I strike, because I want it a little bit smaller so I can pull it taut. So this is positioned just right, because you can see it's just a slight bit smaller than the overall size of this ruler, but this makes it nice for going around curves. Watch. So I've got it against this edge, and all I need to do is take my scribe ball pencil and mark a line around this, and as it goes around the curve, I'll just take my fingers in the front and I'll press it around the curve and mark around that curve, so I've got perfect 1/2 inch from the edge. And I'll just do this all around the perimeter here. So now that we have it marked to size, this side I have already a little bit small, but because I want it a little bit smaller than a 1/2 inch so it pulls nice and taut, notice how I'm cutting on the inside of my line that I struck. So I'm going to go all the way around, so it's a slight bit smaller than a 1/2 inch. The 1/2 inch is going to be taken up in our seam allowance.
In this next chapter, we'll create our boxing.
To measure for our banding, I'm just going to put a piece of tape on the end of my flexible ruler and put it on the end there at one of the corners and go around following the contour of the top, so I can determine exactly how much banding that I need. And I want to do extra, so I need at least 71 inches. I'm going to do at least 73 inches. Now how wide do we want our boxing or our banding? Well, this is like what, less than 1.5 inches, but we do need it to come around the back side and staple to the back side. 3 inches will probably do it. It'll make it a little bit more difficult to staple into here, because 3 inches will basically fall into that. But I don't like to have too much extra. I could go 4, but I'm just going to make them 3 inches wide, and it'll be plenty to wrap around. I really do like to use a clear acrylic ruler and the rotary cutter with a cutting mat. The cutting mat helps to prolong the life of your blade. And since our fabric is 54 inches wide, I'm going to have to cut 2 strips, or a strip that's a little bit smaller than the one, because I need at least 73 inches, I believe is what I said. So I'll have to sew some together to make it long enough. To join this up, I'm going to put this one with the outside surface facing up. This is the outside surface, so the outside surfaces are facing each other. I'm going to make sure they're lined up well. And I often like to staple things in place so they're lined up perfectly. That way when I take it to the sewing machine, it just makes my job a lot easier. So I'm going to make sure that I put a staple no deeper than a 1/2 inch from the edge. That way I can sew a 1/2 inch here, and that will be my seam to join them up. I'm going to sew a 1/2 inch from the raw edge, and I'm just using the needle plate as a guide. It has a 1/2 inch mark on it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just do a teeny bit of reversing here at the edge, just to lock the stitch in place, and sew down to the other side. Now we can put a top stitch on this if you'd like, but I don't think I'm going to. The reason I'm not going to put a top stitch in this is that it's going to not be visible, and it'll probably be in a spot where it's going to be up against the wall. And I can also splay this out like this to make the transition nice and smooth when I sew it.
In this chapter, we'll sew the boxing to our top plate.
For this tabletop, this is the outside edge, and then this edge is up against the wall. So what I like to do is determine where do I want to start sewing my banding on, so I won't see any stitches sewing the banding together or my seam. So I'll start it around that corner, and then I can join it together here. So this will be on against the wall, won't be visible, and this will be against the wall, won't be visible. I have a nice clean run everywhere it's going to be visible. This piece is going to go on like that. That's where it fits. So here is where I will start sewing my banding together. So outside surfaces face each other here, and we're going to lay the banding here, and we'll start sewing here. Why do we leave this unsewn? Because this has to be joined when it reaches this side. So we're starting to sew 3 to 4 inches away from that side, and also 3 to 4 inches away from this corner here, so we can get around the corner. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my deluxe 5.5 inch magnetic guide a 1/2 inch away from the needle. There's a 1/2 inch mark on the needle plate indicating that. My needle is in the center position, and I will start sewing here. I'm not going to do any reversing here. We're just going to start sewing to that corner. Now when I reach the corner, so if you'd like, you could put a pencil mark here at a 1/2 inch from that corner there, and you could put one here. So when we reach that point, we know where to basically turn that corner, because our seam allowance is a 1/2 inch. So I'm going to sew using the magnetic guide to make sure that the stitch is a 1/2 inch away from the edge. And then when I reach this corner, I'm going to stop with the needle at that 1/2 inch location. And if I need to make adjustments, I can use the reverse lever to do so. That's about right there. Now the needle's buried, and I can lift my foot, and what I want to do is I want to cut 90 degrees into that mark with some scissors. Now I'm going to make this easy by moving the magnetic guide so you can kind of hopefully see what I'm doing, but I'm going to cut only the boxing, and I'm not going to cut all the way to the 1/2 inch. I'm going to stay about an 1/8 inch away from that. And I notice that I'm basically 90 degrees to the corner, or straight into that corner. Now what I can do is I can pivot on the needle, and you can see how that opens up that turn, and then I can lower my foot now, making sure there's no wrinkles. I can put my magnetic guide back, and I can sew this direction now. And what I'll actually do is I'll actually do reversing, just to secure that down well, and sew down this side. Now I want to make sure that I match up these edges as I go. So I'm going to hold, and notice there's a little bend here, so I'm going to hold right here. What matters is it matched up right directly across from the needle and this guide, and it is so far. Now I'm going to take this bend, and I'm going to twist the fabric a little bit and follow that. And then continue to match it up going around. Now we're coming to this curve. Oh, I also want you to know that I'm sewing in about a 3 to 4 millimeter stitch length for this first stitch. So now we're just following this curve, matching up the edge, making sure that it's a 1/2 inch away directly across from that needle location. just take your time doing this. Now we're coming to a seam, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to splay it apart so that it lays nice and flat. So I'm going to take this flange and lay it this way, and this one laying the opposite way. So it'll be less obvious, though this is going to be up against a wall anyway. But if it weren't, it would just look better that way. So here we're coming to another 90-degree corner, and if you'd like, you can mark a 1/2 inch from that corner here, and a 1/2 inch from the edge of the boxing here. So we'll sew up to that. We'll stop our needle at the 1/2 inch location, and again I'll make adjustments if I need to with the reverse lever to make sure the needle lands right where I want it. There we go. I can lift my foot, I can move this out of the way. I'm going to cut directly into that area about an 1/8 inch away from the needle, just cutting the boxing only. I'm going to now roll the material around. I'm going to put my magnetic guide back on the 1/2 inch mark of the needle plate. I'm going to lower my foot, and then I'm going to sew forward and do some reversing here and continue around. And when we get to the part where we need to join the boxing to the opposite end, we'll show you what's next. Now we're coming up to where we started to sew here. You can see the boxing here, and I'm going to leave about that much unsewn, and I'm not going to do any reversing. So now I'm going to take it out and take it to the workbench, and we'll show you what we do now to join that up. So here's what our corner looks like when we do it like that, and when you turn it right side out, you get a nice looking corner. So for this boxing strip, I'm going to put my clear acrylic ruler on here and mark a 1/2 inch. This is just for reference for you. This is where we'll be sewing. And what I want to do with this strip is I want to mark it where that 1/2 inch is here. And then obviously you would want to cut a 1/2 inch away from that mark, because that's where we're going to, we'll include our 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now make sure that it's straight with the edge of the boxing or perpendicular to that edge. That's why you use a clear acrylic ruler. So this is our cut right here on this boxing. So I'll take my scissors and I'll cut it nice and straight. And when we sew this together, this will result in our boxing being exactly the right length to sew onto the plate. And if you'd like to be careful and make sure that nothing moves, you could staple these two together so they're directly on top of each other. Outside surfaces are facing each other. That way it doesn't move when you sew it. And to sew this, I'm going to do a little bit of reversing here at the beginning. And we're just going to sew a 1/2 inch from that edge. And a little bit of reversing here. Now we can remove the staples. Here's our previous stitches. We're going to just start sewing about an inch or so on top of those previous stitches. I buried my needle on the stitch so I make sure that I'm right on it. And we will sew to where we began, and we'll splay this down flat. And then we want to make sure that we run into those stitches, and we'll sew about an inch in those stitches. That way I don't have to do any reversing, because sometimes reversing makes it obvious when you look at an assembly that there's some extra stitches in there. But now, look at that, that looks great.
In this next chapter, we'll add a decorative top stitch to our tabletop cover.
I'm changing now to a navy thread because I think it'll look good as our top stitch. And you may notice that this is the Sayride Ultrafeed LSE with the Worker Bee Power Pack system. It's brand new and it is phenomenal. That's why I get all this super slow speed control. With these 90-degree corners, I like to cut out the excess, and I want to make sure that I don't cut into my stitch, obviously. So cutting off a corner like this, and I still have a good 1/8 inch of fabric there. We're going to be creating a top stitch that's going to come up and fold onto our top plate, and that will take out a lot of the bulk when we create that top stitch. So I'm going to do that at each 90-degree corner. Now we do the top stitch, I like to do the maximum stitch length of 6 millimeters for the Sayride Ultrafeed sewing machine, so I'm going to set the stitch length at 6 millimeters. We do not need the magnetic guide, so I'm just going to put it there. I'm going to start, this is the edge against the wall, and this is the front edge here. So I'm going to start my stitch at the back corner here. I'm going to put this in the machine, and I'm going to splay this out. So I'm up against my stitch, and I'm going to make sure that my seam allowance is towards the plate, in other words going that direction. This is my tail or seam allowance. And make sure everything is nice and flat, laying there as best as possible. So I'm just working it out with my fingers, and I want to start sewing so that my top stitch is basically equal to what it'll be from this edge. So I'm going to lower my foot, and I'm going to use the inside foot as a guide, and I'm going to sew this slowly because this is a stitch that everybody's going to see. And looks like I need to go in reverse a little bit. I need to lock my stitch anyway, so I'm going to put the machine in reverse and sew backwards first. 1, and then 2, right there. And now I can sew in forwards. I've locked my stitch in place. And I just want to do this ever so slowly and make sure that I'm sewing into my seam allowance on the bottom side. And I'm pulling my fabric left and right as I sew so that I'm on that first stitch. But I don't want to pull so much that it causes my vinyl to separate. So I'm just pulling enough that it's right on that stitch. And every once in a while you should probably check to make sure that you're sewing through your seam allowance. You can see that it's folded back the right direction here. I'm getting close to this curve here. When you get to a gentle curve like this, you just have to take your time and splay the fabric out nicely as you go. Make sure the tail's folded the right way, or the seam allowance. I always call it a tail. Look at this low speed control I have with this thing. That Workhorse Servo Power Pack, that Worker Bee Power Pack system is just phenomenal. So I'm getting close to this 90-degree turn, and I'll sew up to it, making sure that tail's in the right spot, and it is. Pull the fabric apart to make sure that it's not bunched up. And before I reach the other end, I want to bury the needle right about where I'd want my turn to be. I know this might be a little bit hard for you to see, but right there. So now my needle's buried and came up slightly, and I lifted my foot, and now I can roll around, and I can take a tool. I can take a tool here, and I can tuck the seam allowance back. And now I can lower my foot and sew down the side. So that's all you do at a 90-degree turn for your top stitch. We're going to cut this before I reach that corner. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come around the corner and just do a top stitch onto my other top stitch. So here we're coming to that stitch. We're almost on top of it. I'm going to adjust it by using my reverse lever. Now I'm right on top of it. I'm going to turn this around with my foot up, and then I'm just going to sew forward once and back once. Forward once, and that's it.
In this next chapter, we'll staple the vinyl to the tabletop.
The front of our table is here, this side, and doggone if I didn't put a seam there at the wrong spot. I think it's going to look okay. It's not that ugly, but I really would have rather had the seam someplace in the back against the wall. Oh well. Now we're going to insert the tabletop into the cover that we just made. That looks good so far. Make sure that these are splayed out like this, any seam. So we don't want that to be a bump, so splay it out like that. When we get to that staple point, we'll check that. What I like to do is I like to start at the 90-degree corners. So at this corner, what I like to do is I like to make sure that my seam is right on the edge of the table, and then staple it in place. And I'm only going to put one staple in the corners right now just to make sure that I get it in the right spot. So there, and then my seam here, I want it on the edge of that table, and we're going to have to cut away some of the fabric here, but right now I can just staple here. This is just a trim piece for the wall. That looks good. Then I'm going to go to the other 90-degree corner and make sure that it's in the right spot. Good. And I'll put a staple here. That looks good. And then we'll go to this corner, make sure that it's laying flat. Oh, notice the wrinkles here because it's taking a curve. I didn't do this, but we can still do it here. See all these wrinkles here? So these wrinkles can be relieved by actually cutting. You just don't want to go into your top stitch. Some relief slits into the flange. Don't cut your top plate, that's for sure. And don't cut into that top stitch. So just be shy of it. But this can sometimes help to relieve the fabric that has to shrink up because it's taking a curve. You can do this prior to sewing as well, but the problem with doing this prior to sewing is that sometimes it makes it more difficult to keep that seam allowance tucked into the plate as you're sewing the top stitch. So I technically like to do it after I'm done with my top stitch. Now we could do that over here too, but this one, yeah, I think I will do it over here too. So I'm going to lift this up before we get it all stapled down. So you can see the seam here, right at the edge of the table. That's what we want. So we're going to pull the vinyl around. I'm going to put a staple on the side. It probably could be on the bottom here as well. Nobody's really going to see that, but I'd rather have it hidden. That looks good here. Okay, so let's see, does that corner look good? Yes, that looks great. Let's go to the next curved corner here. Pull it so the seam is at the edge. There it is. I'm trying to do this in such a way that you can see it too, but sometimes I have to flip it up anyway. There we go. Now here, this is the back edge, so it doesn't really matter where I staple. Nice. I'm using the Serrate upholstery staple gun with 3/8" staples. Now, let's make sure this is flat. It is. pulled nicely. Put a staple here. Make sure this one's flat. It's not right now. You can see it's tucked back. So we want to make sure that it's totally flat like this. Butterflied out. Okay, now check it out and see if it's going to look good, and then just start stapling around the perimeter until you get it all secured. So now we'll put our staples a little bit closer together because I'm happy with it. Put one here in the middle. Over on this side needs some stapling. It's not together. This is a little bump here that was designed to hug the corner of the wall. Nice. So here we have a transition, and we have two pieces of board, so it makes it hard to push this fabric down. So what you want to do is you want to cut a relief slit here, going no deeper than the edge. So this is the back wall, and might as well cut one here too. This will allow this to be pulled like that, and we could put a staple or two there. Now what do you want to do with this? You want to come across, or you want to come down? It's pretty much whatever you want to do. I'm going to come across like this. Again, this is a corner, so nobody's really going to see it. Like that. And now all we got to do is staple around the perimeter, securing our staples about that distance apart from each other. Here's another transition. So we're going to cut a slit to go around that so this can relax here. And it's already stapled pretty much in place. Here's another one. Cut there. Cut here. That way the fabric can go around that obstacle and be stapled. Here at this corner, I'm going to cut here and cut here. This allows me to pull this nicely to reduce the bulk, and then I can staple that down here, and I can actually cut this away here. So that's one way to get a corner done. And then we have a little bit of fabric sticking up here, so I'll just put a staple there. We're just going to trim away the excess so that when we push it up into our side tables, we don't have anything that gets in the way. There we go. She's done. Let's see what she looks like. Yes. Very nice.
Coming up next, a list of materials and tools we use to accomplish this project. If you have any questions, be sure to give us a call or email. We're glad to help. From all of us here at Sailrite, I'm Seth Grant. Thanks for watching.
If you enjoyed this video, click the link in the description below or at the icon at the top right to check out other projects in the Airstream Argosy renovation series.